Police brutality against Indigenous people is alarmingly common in Australia. You see it all the time, and more alarmingly than the brutality itself is the reaction or lack thereof. You repeatedly see police just fail to investigate, prosecutors fail to put their case together properly, they run these matters dead, they don't investigate them, and they sympathise with the perpetrators of this violence. All the time you see this. Victim blaming is often is looked down upon so much in Australia in almost every other context. Just the other day you saw that young Indigenous teenager in Surrey Hills slam face first into the ground, and all you can hear people talk about is, as the Commissioner of Police said, the officer was having a bad day. A young teenager has had his teeth chipped after having restrained then slammed face first, but it's okay because the officer was having a bad day. That is the attitude. It comes all the way from the top, and it is what prevents any kind of justice from occurring in this nation.
There's the case of Tane Chatfield, who was an outstanding kid at school, loved by his peers, loved by his teachers. At his Catholic school, a great footballer. At the age of 15, he graffitied the wall of a shopping centre, just writing his email address. That was all he wrote. And for that he got 3 months in a children's prison at the age of 15. And I've represented graffiti artists who have made a career out of daubing illegally walls of large buildings, and they're repeat offenders, and they've never gone to jail once as adults or as children. And the fines that they've faced have been minimal. The inequitable treatment of Indigenous offenders compared with white offenders is legend. It's unbelievable, it's incredible. And eventually he was incarcerated again in respect of a charge of being involved in a break and enter, a burglary, in circumstances where he was never convicted. He was on remand for more than 2 years, and when he finally came up to trial, he was found dead in his cell. The circumstances of his death have never been established to the point where anybody could be reasonably satisfied. That is, the police alleged he suicided because the circumstances were such that it seemed unlikely. He had a young child, he had a loving partner, and his trial had gone particularly well, and it looked as though he was likely to be acquitted. And not unusually, this very young man, from memory he was 22 at the time, was in a cell where there was an exposed pipe, there was a sheet in the cell from which he was alleged to have hanged himself. And it's remarkable that just as in the case of Murungi, Doomadgee and Palm Island, that just happened to be the part of the cell where there was no CCTV. There's never any CCTV to record what happens to Indigenous people in jail. There's never any recording of what happens to them, like in the Rodney King case or the George Flloyd case, because in Australia, although there's been many instances where we've seen that people have used their mobile phones to make audio-visual recordings of what occurred, the police never seek out that material. It never becomes evidence in any court case. At least it never becomes evidence in any court case tendered by the police. Well, it was the most shocking situation of somebody who was just picked up for a DUI being transported by a privatised prison transfer service which was effectively a paddy wagon, and over a protracted period, without any relief, without anybody checking on him, he basically was barbecued alive for being for having drunk too much. You have to recognise there's a very different experience in Australia of black people, both of themselves and of the white population. In America, there's an amazing cohesion amongst the African Americans, because they all had a common experience. They were all brought there as slaves, and their families were all the descendants of slaves. Whereas in Australia, there were disparate tribes spread all over the country with many different language groups, and many people in different parts of the country had a different experience from people in other parts of the country. Also, one of the byproducts of slavery was that black and white people lived at very close quarters with each other, and they had a greater understanding of each other, whether they liked each other or not, whether they had contempt or disdain for each other. There was a lot more intermingling between African Americans and white Americans by virtue of the fact that they were largely living on the same plantations. And afterwards, they were working side by side in many instances and living in large cities in very cramped conditions in many instances. Whereas in Australia, there were instances of people being forced together, but the interaction with white people was a lot less, and the understanding of white Australians, of Indigenous people, Indigenous culture is hugely lacking compared with the exposure that white Americans have had to black Americans. It's probably only to be expected that there would be a greater level of empathy between decent, liberal, humane white Americans and the African American population. However, in Australia, it's clear that there's a huge amount of apathy towards the enormous injustice that's being perpetrated to the Aborigines. The rate of incarceration is even greater and more disproportionate than it is in the United States to their presence of the population. And the incidence of violence and ill treatment and injustice towards Indigenous people is, I would say, as a percentage of the population, greater than the United States as well. And yet, Australian white people are extremely apathetic when there are deaths in custody in Sydney, or there's a huge discrepancy between the way black people are treated and white people are treated under the criminal justice system. You might get a demonstration with 200, 250 people participating, 75 to 80% of whom will be Aboriginal, and the rest will be members of the Spartacists or some other extreme left organisation. Students are sadly absent, trade unions are sadly absent. The level of apathy amongst people that should be expected to be activists in this situation is incredible and disappointing to an extent that's hard to grasp.